Let me tell you about a moment that changed how I think about organizational honesty. I was consulting with a mid-sized technology company several years ago. They had brought me in because a major project launch had failed spectacularly, and they wanted to understand what went wrong. During the postmortem interviews, I sat down with a project manager named David. He was a solid performer with about 8 years at the company. David told me something I've never forgotten. He said, I knew we were going to miss the deadline by at least 6 weeks. I knew it in my gut 3 months before launch. But every time I raised concerns in our status meetings, my director would ask, are you saying you can't do your job? So I stopped raising concerns. I started saying what everyone else was saying. We're on track. We'll make it work. But here's the part that really stuck with me. I also interviewed his director, a woman named Susan, who was genuinely respected in the organization. When I asked her about the project's communication breakdown, she said, I wish someone had told me how bad things really were. I wish I would have pushed back the timeline. I would have gotten them more resources. But every update I received said we were fine. I asked her directly, what would have happened if David had told you the project was 6 weeks behind? She paused for a long moment, and then she said something that revealed everything. Honestly, I probably would have pushed back. I would have asked him to find a way. I would have questioned whether he was managing his team effectively. As she shared this with me, she caught herself. I guess, she said, I'm part of the reason no one told me the truth. What struck me about that conversation was how both people were trapped. David lacked the courage to speak honestly because he feared how Susan would respond. And Susan, well, without realizing it, she had created an environment where honesty felt dangerous. Both of them were good people. Neither wanted the project to fail. But the lies they told and the lies they enabled guaranteed the failure. This is what I call the courage gap, and it operates on both sides of every conversation. It takes courage to tell the truth, but it also takes courage to hear it. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, and the Ideas and Innovations Weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. Here's something that might make you uncomfortable. You lied today. Maybe you told a colleague their presentation was great when it was mediocre. Maybe you said you were almost done with a project you hadn't even started yet. Maybe you called in sick when you just needed a mental health day. And here's what's even more uncomfortable. I've done all those things too. We all have. Research suggests that an average person tells between 1 or 2 lies per day in social interactions. In workplace settings, that number increases significantly. But here's what confounds me at times as someone who has spent 2 decades studying organizational transformation. Those small lies, those tiny acts of workplace dishonesty, they're not harmless. They're the invisible force destroying your organization's ability to change, adapt, and survive. So today, we're going somewhere very uncomfortable. In the next 25 minutes or so, you'll discover why people lie at work, the psychology behind workplace deception, what it costs your organization, and most importantly, why addressing workplace dishonesty and the courage deficit that enables it is the hidden key to change and transformation success. Let's start with a fundamental question. Why do people lie? Dr. Paul Ekman, the pioneering psychologist who spent decades studying deception, identified 6 core reasons people engage in dishonesty. First, to obtain a reward they couldn't get otherwise. Second, to protect others from harm or discomfort. Third, to win admiration or approval. Fourth, to avoid awkward social situations. Fifth, to avoid embarrassment. And sixth, to exercise control over their own narrative. Now, here's what's fascinating about this list. Notice how many of these motivations are fundamentally about self-protection rather than malicious intent. Most workplace lying isn't about getting ahead at someone else's expense. It's simply about survival. The statistics on workplace lying are sobering. According to research published in human resource journals, approximately 78% of job candidates admit to lying during the hiring process. Once hired, "I'm not feeling well" remains the most common workplace lie. But here's where it gets really interesting. Research from David Schulman at Lafayette College found that younger employees tend to lie more frequently than older colleagues. And employees lie more on Mondays and Fridays, essentially extending their weekends through deception. Most importantly here, dissatisfied employees lie significantly more than satisfied ones. So when people feel trapped, undervalued, or voiceless, they turn to deception as a coping mechanism. It's interesting, isn't it? So now let's go deeper into the psychology. When someone lies, their brain has to work harder. They need to suppress the truth, construct the lie, monitor the listener's response, and remember what they said for later consistency. This cognitive load is exhausting. But here's the twist. The brain has a solution. It's called self-deception. When we lie to ourselves first, we reduce the cognitive burden of lying to others. We become more convincing because we genuinely believe our own distortions. Leon Festinger's cognitive dishonesty research demonstrated this beautifully. In his classic studies, people who were paid just $1 to tell a lie actually convinced themselves that they believed the lie, while those paid $20 knew they were lying. The brain seeks consistency and certainty, and when our actions conflict with our beliefs, something has to give. So in organizational settings, this means employees don't just lie to their managers. They often lie to themselves first. This project is on track becomes something they genuinely believe, even as all the evidence they're seeing mounts to the contrary. In 2015, researchers Levitt and Sluice published groundbreaking work on what they called identity-based lying. Their core insight was that workplace lying isn't primarily about self-interest in the traditional sense. It's about protecting valued identities. Think about it this way. When you identify strongly with your role, like "I'm a competent project manager" or "I'm a strategic thinker," anything that threatens that identity triggers a defensive response. And lying becomes a way to protect who you believe yourself to be. Remember back in episode 8 when I discussed resistance traps and the challenges of identity protectionism. This is particularly dangerous when identity threats feel intractable, meaning that people believe there's no legitimate way to resolve the threat. If admitting a mistake feels like admitting you're fundamentally incompetent, lying becomes psychologically necessary. So, earlier research by Grover in 1993 identified another critical driver of workplace deception: structural role conflicts. Organizations often create impossible situations where employees face conflicting expectations. You're told to be innovative, but you're punished for failure. You're expected to meet aggressive deadlines, but also deliver perfect quality. You're supposed to be a team player, but you're evaluated on individual metrics. When these conflicts become unresolvable, people lie to reduce dissonance. In my consulting work, I've seen this pattern repeatedly. Middle managers caught between executive expectations and team realities become chronic liars in both directions. They tell leadership what they want to hear while telling the teams that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. So let's talk about the numbers here. According to research published by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, organizations lose approximately 5% of their annual revenues to fraud and deception. Globally, that translates to trillions of dollars. But the hidden costs are actually even larger. When employees lie about project status, problems compound until they become crises. When teams hide concerns about a new strategy, organizations invest millions in initiatives doomed to simply fail. When leaders don't hear honest feedback, they make decisions based on distorted information. And here's the kicker. Research shows that senior positions actually lie more frequently than entry-level roles. One study found that 37% of managers admitted to lying at work, compared to 28% of entry-level employees. The people making the biggest decisions then often have the most distorted information. Let's dive into psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's revolutionary research in the 1990s made a discovery that transformed our understanding of team performance. She was studying medical teams in hospitals, trying to understand why some teams perform better than others. What she found seemed counterintuitive at first. Higher performing teams reported more errors than lower performing teams. That didn't make sense until she realized the explanation. Better teams weren't making more mistakes. They were simply more willing to discuss the mistakes that they had made. The insight led her to the concept of psychological safety, which she defines as a belief that you can speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes without fear of repercussions. It's an environment of low interpersonal fear where candor and vulnerability are welcome. Elizabeth Stewart and I have both sought to emphasize the criticality of psychological safety in the episodes of this podcast. So let's dive into what psychological safety is not. There's a common misperception that we haven't touched on at this point yet. Psychological safety is not about being comfortable. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's not about lowering standards or removing accountability. In fact, Edmondson's research shows that psychological safety and accountability are very two independent dimensions that actually reinforce each other. When you have high psychological safety but low accountability, you get a comfort zone where nothing gets done. When you have high accountability but low psychological safety, you get an anxiety zone where people are too afraid to take risks. The sweet spot then is the high performance zone requires both. People need to feel safe enough to be honest and accountable enough to drive for excellence. So here's what happens neurologically when people don't feel psychologically safe. Fear activates the amygdala, triggering fight or flight responses. This diverts cognitive resources away from the prefrontal cortex, which handles analytical thinking, creativity, and complex problem solving. In other words, when employees are afraid, they literally become less intelligent. They can't think as clearly, they can't innovate as effectively, or solve problems as creatively. And of course, they lie then to protect themselves. The organizational cost in this situation is profound. Problems go unreported until they become crises. Innovation stalls because people fear proposing ideas that might fail. And transformation efforts collapse because no one tells leadership the truth about what's actually happening on the ground. Let me connect all of this to organizational transformation. Research from McKinsey surveys of over 3,000 executives show that only about one-third of transformation efforts are considered successful. That's a staggering failure rate. When you dig into why transformations fail, you find the same pattern again and again. Leaders don't hear honest feedback about what's working and what isn't. Employees tell leadership what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Problems then are hidden until they become insurmountable. In essence, organizational dishonesty creates a fundamental barrier to adaptation. You can't transform what you can't honestly assess. And you can't honestly assess anything in a culture where people are afraid to tell the truth. So, in my human factor method, the first phase is called understand, which involves deep psychological discovery before any change initiative begins. Part of that effort must include understanding where dishonesty patterns exist in your organization. This isn't about catching liars or punishing people. It's about understanding the structural conditions that make lying feel necessary. Where are the impossible role conflicts? What identity threats are people facing? Where has psychological safety broken down? Our transformation readiness assessment helps organizations identify these patterns before they sabotage change efforts. Because if you launch a major transformation in a culture of fear and dishonesty, you're setting yourself up for failure. So let's continue here. Edmondson's research provides a 4-step framework for building psychological safety that aligns perfectly with my human factor method principles. First, framework as a learning problem. When leaders emphasize uncertainty, acknowledge that they don't have all the answers and explicitly state that they need everyone's input. It creates a situation where permission is there for honesty. Second, model fallibility and curiosity. Leaders must demonstrate vulnerability by admitting their own mistakes and asking questions that show genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Third, invite participation proactively. Don't wait for people to speak up. Create explicit structures in moments where feedback is requested and expected. Fourth, respond productively. This is where most organizations fail. When someone speaks truth to power and gets punished, even subtly, the message spreads instantly. Everyone learns that honesty is dangerous. So let me give you some practical actions you can take starting tomorrow. Prioritize honesty as a core value and actually mean it. Don't just put it on a poster. Demonstrate it through your actions that truth-telling is rewarded even when the truth is uncomfortable. Model that transparency yourself. Share your own uncertainties, your mistakes, and your learning moments. If you expect honesty from others, you have to demonstrate it first. Recalibrate your performance management systems. If your metrics punish honest admission of the problems, you're incentivizing deception. Create space for learning from failure rather than just celebrating the successes. Create visible ethical reminders. Research has shown that simple prompts like honesty pledges at the beginning of a process can reduce deceptive behavior significantly. And finally, address the structural conditions that make lying feel necessary. If people are caught in impossible role conflicts, fix the conflicts. If identity threat feels intractable, create pathways for people to maintain their sense of competence while admitting mistakes. Let me leave you with something to consider. The irony of organizational dishonesty is profound. Organizations that most desperately need to transform often have cultures that punish honesty, which guarantees their transformation efforts will fail, which reinforces the very problems that made transformation necessary in the first place. Breaking this cycle requires courage. It requires leaders who are willing to hear uncomfortable truths and who examine their own reactions when someone speaks honestly. Remember David and Susan from the beginning of this episode. The lies didn't start with David. They started with Susan's inability to receive hard news without making it feel like an attack on the messenger. David needed courage to speak, but Susan needed courage to listen. It requires systems make honesty safer than deception. And it requires understanding that people don't lie because they're bad. They lie because they're human, and humans protect themselves. The question isn't whether your organization has dishonesty. It does. The question is whether you have the psychological infrastructure to surface it, address it, and transform it into the radical candor that successful change requires. You have the opportunity to explore 2 issues of my Ideas and Innovations newsletter available on 2040digital.com and Substack. The first, Leading with Courage, and the second, Why We Lie. Both offer the opportunity to further understand why people lie and why people lack courage to speak honestly and accept feedback. You also get to understand the structural barriers to organizational candor and the characteristics of courageous leadership. If you found this episode helpful, subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and a comment, and share this episode with your leadership team, because understanding why people lie at work is the first step towards building a culture where they don't have to. If you want weekly insights about transformation psychology, organizational behavior, and the human factors that determine transformation success, subscribe to the Ideas and Innovations newsletter on Substack or 2040digital.com. Every week, I share practical frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. Until next time, remember, you can't transform what you can't honestly assess. This has been the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.